Jazz music had a widespread and largely important cultural impact on the United States post-Reformation society. The music and its critics bring attention to important topics such as feminism and misogyny, racism, LGBTQ+ rights, and social inequalities. In the first article, the author talks about James Buddy Bolden, who is viewed as the father of jazz music. There were problems between musicians and critics, and books like Jazzmen and Shining Trumpets show the accuracy of the first jazz documents and how criticisms were based upon little. However, Bolden still is viewed as a hero by other musicians. The invention of jazz brought forward new recording and sound technologies. Critics viewed these as a lack of authenticity and claimed it to be improvisation. These criticisms were picked up despite that there have not been any recordings of Buddy Bolden found, and likely there never will be. This has led to a lot of narrative play within jazz. This article talks about jazz and television and its impact during the Jim Crow era. There are musical changes both audibly and visibly in Duke Ellington's project, A Drum is a Woman, and it shows the development of various musical styles and tracks key moments in jazz history. Duke Ellington was widely listened to during this time. A Drum is a Woman helped create a worldwide exploration into race issues. Jazz bands appeared in many silent films, but with new sound recording technology, popular people such as Duke Ellington were able to be featured, but only as a sort of soundtrack, with white actors playing on the stage or on the recording instead of the black bands. Other important topics the rise of jazz brought up was feminism, specifically black feminism. Black women being musicians brought up even more criticism than the hate that black men were getting. This was a time when women and African Americans had very little rights, and least of all black women, who were supposed to act, look, and behave a certain way. One very famous jazz musician was, and still is, Ella Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was widely known as the First Lady of Song and won 13 Grammy Awards. Despite all of this, her critics took jabs at her bandleader and his masculinity for hiring her. Her success meant nothing to these critics solely because she was a black woman making it big. When jazz first began taking off, there were more critics than there were fans, and many of these critics were of the older generation. The older white generation did not like the style of jazz because it vastly differed from the type of music that they were used to, and because it was growing largely in these black communities and they could not do anything about it or to stop it. The book, From Devil's Music to Juking, Jazz Performance in the Black Community, talks about how the older black generation thought jazz was, quote, devil's music, but the younger people argued that it started in the churches. Some Renaissance leaders, like W.E.B. Du Bois, understood the cultural impact even though they did not agree with its message. This article, like the one before, talks about how people used to describe jazz. Critics of jazz culture coined demonizing terms to describe how they viewed it as an evil in society. Jazz created a rebellion in the younger generations when they began to talk about marijuana, social inequality, and the like, which offended the older generations. A few of the negative terms associated with jazz culture stemmed from the, quote, controversial topics musicians sang about. Vamps referred to women who took part in what people believed to be underground things. Jazz devil refers to the overall jazz culture and how people associated it with Satanism. And jungle roots refers to the origination of jazz music. Another way critics demonized jazz music was the dancing associated with jazz. Women during this time were supposed to act a certain way and look a certain way, and the energetic style of jazz dancing was the polar opposite of how they were supposed to be. The changing views of an opening society and accepting these women dancers helped pave the way for modern feminism. Some of the popular jazz dances were ragtime dances, which were, quote, ragged rhythm dances, the Charleston, the Lindy Hop, and the Mambo. These dances were fast-paced and involved a lot of quick movement. Critics wanted to still these dancers, but supporters wanted to showcase the dancers and their talent, especially the women who were shut down at this time. On top of black and women's rights, jazz music also talked about LGBTQ+ rights and topics. This directly connects to the demonization of jazz music, since queer culture was already associated with anti-Christian things. Musicians like Billy Strayhorn opened the doors to talking about these controversial topics and integrating them into a more accepting society. Billy Strayhorn often wrote about sexual or romantic encounters with other men and added the message of acceptance of his own identity and culture in his work. He was often able to get away with it due to his friendship with Duke Ellington, but an overlap of racial and queer violence came from many famous black musicians being targeted during these times. Women not only were important figures in the music itself, but also in the spread of jazz music. Jazz music was often played in clubs and bars, and people believed that that is where it originated. These places became safe spaces for African Americans to enjoy themselves. Black women shaped a large part of jazz culture and women's rights by being some of the first to own and run a business. Women in slavery did not have a voice at all, so these club owners helped give everyone an even louder voice. Some famous female musicians include Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and Sarah Vaughan. These three women were considered a dominating trio in the jazz industry. Mary Shines was also famous for her home-brewed alcohol, Betsy Cole for her lawn parties, and Ada Smith for her multiple clubs. The book Blues, Empress, and Black Chattanooga was a run-through of Bessie Smith's life and her influence on the South and Southern music. Southern music, especially jazz, stemmed from slave field haulers, and black people were embracing these negative terms and backstories for the music by making jazz popular. It is important for singers like Bessie Smith to be acknowledged because women are constantly overlooked for their male counterparts. Southern music in modern times is mostly a white, male-dominated thing, but in jazz times, black people gave Southern music its roots. Acknowledging the start of Southern music plays a huge part in making space for African American society, which is a major part in the book Blues, Empress, and Black Chattanooga. Jazz music was a huge part in bringing people and cultures together, but it also divided others. It divided white and black people even more than they already were post-slavery. These lyrics, dancing, and emerging cultures made the prim and proper whites uncomfortable. As I've talked about previously, it also divided generations. Youth culture came from jazz culture, and the elders did not like the change. The impact of jazz is a large one that can still be studied years later.